Hello, this is Brett. Welcome back on my reading of the seventh vial. This is a portion of the book we're getting well into the topic now, as of our last session on the seventh vial, and getting right to the heart of it. We're speaking about James Aiken Wylie 172 years ago, writing this book about the emancipation of Great Britain and what was happening 20 years after the fact. These long-term historical viewpoints James Aiken Wylie is expressing to us in his writings. So here we are at the seventh vial, and we're going to continue on page 323. And I'm going to backtrack a sentence here. When the seventh angel had poured out his vial, and the great voice from the throne had announced, "It is done," there were voices, thunders, and lightnings. These are the symbols of popular commotions, tumults, insurrection, and wars. Let us again turn to passing events as affording a commentary more striking and exact than any which the mere imagination can supply. How plain is it that the present crisis has been brought on by the action of the three principles indicated in the prophecy: absolutism, infidel democracy, and popery. Both the long previous preparation and the ultimate outbreak have been their work. Since the close of the last war, these three principles have been fiercely struggling for the ascendancy in every country of Europe. Indeed, the history of Europe since 1815 is but the history of the progress of these principles. The civil war in Switzerland last autumn was occasioned by the intrigues of these identical parties: the communists, the oligarchists, and the priests. Equally easy is it to trace the operation of these principles in the late terrible convulsion in France, speaking of the French Revolution. The policy of the court, guided by the Romish party, which aimed at restoring the Bourbon throne, the full despotic sway wielded before the First Revolution, came into collision with the growing democracy of the country, and in the collision, the monarchy was lost. And when the revolution came, it found the whole of Europe prepared. The change had been already wrought and needed only such an event as that of the 23rd of February to reveal it. Does any man imagine that these old dynasties and empires could have been shattered in a day and changed like the scene in a pantomime if all had been ready beforehand? Surely no. In these sudden and astonishing changes we behold the mighty effects which have followed the mission of the three frogs. Another striking coincidence is the fact that the present convulsions have followed an interval of profound quiet. It is plain from the prophecy that such an interval would precede the pouring out of the seventh vial. After the calamities of the first 5 vials and during the pouring out of the sixth, the Western world was to enjoy repose. This is apparent from the following considerations. The scene of the sixth vial in the Euphrates, implying a removal of judgment from the West. The successful execution of the mission of the frogs, too, demanded the cessation of convulsions, and especially those of war. Moreover, the warning, quote, "Behold, I come as a thief," unquote, implies that the effusion of the seventh vial should take the world by surprise. Men should be dreaming of a long continuance of prosperity and tranquility when all of a sudden the plagues of consummation should overtake them. How confidently were we reckoning on a long peace when these troubles broke out? And, so far as human foresight could reach, the expectation appeared to be well-founded. The generation had not yet passed away who had witnessed the horrors of the last war, and, before plunging into a new one, were likely to inquire whether they would reap more profit from it than they had done from that which preceded it. The warriors and statesmen were still alive who had sworn to wreathe with myrtle and the sword of Waterloo. We possessed other stronger guarantees of tranquility. Peace was multiplied her trophies. Commerce was enlarging her field of operation. The intercourse of nations, daily extending, was strengthening the feeling of amity and the bonds of concord. The press was forming a public opinion strongly adverse to war. It is not many months since the profound tranquility of the Western world and the probable continuance of that tranquility were proclaimed in the thrones of England and France on almost the same day. Yet all these securities have been found of little avail. The affairs of Europe have become complicated beyond the hope of human solution. There have been tumults, insurrections, conflicts all over the continent. War has broken out in several of its countries, characterized by a peculiarly fierce and sanguinary spirit. Peculiarly. Boy, that word always gets me. Okay. War has broken out in several of its countries, characterized by a peculiarly fierce and sanguinary spirit. The shocks of earthquake revolution have followed each other with astounding rapidity. And the firmament is already darkened by the impending horrors of a European war, the gathering of the symbolic hailstorm which is to fall on men, every stone about the weight of a talent. It is farther remarkable that the part of the system affected is precisely that on which the vial is to be poured, the air, the political and social atmosphere. The plagues of the last and consummating vial were not to take their rise from wars of conquest, like the plagues of the preceding vials. They were to spring immediately out of a sudden and awful derangement of the political firmament. How manifest is it that this is the origin of troubles? This is the origin of the troubles in which Europe is at present involved. Not from without have come the evils with which all its countries are at this moment affected. They have arisen from within. They have had their birth in the vitiated state of moral and political feeling. Though the elements of plague had been cast into the natural atmosphere, the contagion could scarce have spread more instantaneously and universally. On the 23rd of February, the revolution broke out in Paris, and before the 5th of March, every country lying between the Atlantic and the Vistula had, in a greater or less degree, been revolutionized. Although the outbreak in France had impregnated the whole atmosphere of Europe with the principles of revolution, the effect could not have been more striking. The contagion crossed the Alps and gave additional urgency to demands which had already begun to be made by the Italian principalities for constitutional rights. It passed the Po and penetrated the very stronghold of European despotism. Metternich fled before it, leaving the once powerful empire whose policy he had so long guided a prey to terrible calamities. It descended the Rhine along its entire course from the mountains of the Black Forest, stirring its dukedoms and electorates into tumult and insurrection. It struck eastward into the very heart of Germany, still producing, wherever it came, the same commotions, voices, lightnings, and thunders. The great kingdom of Prussia felt its shock, and has well nigh been prostrated before it. Its force was spent only when it had reached the Russian frontier. Providence had said to it, quote, "Hitherto, but no farther," unquote. And here, accordingly, its progress was arrested. It will not cross the Vistula, for Russia forms no part of the Romish earth, and Providence has reserved this powerful kingdom, it would appear, for other purposes. We see then the unprecedented extent of the movement. On almost the same day, the various nations inhabiting from the hills of Sicily to the shores of the Baltic have met to discuss the same grievances and urge the same demands. They did not act by concert. Nothing had been arranged beforehand. None were more astonished at what was going on than the actors themselves in these scenes. One mighty influence had moved the minds of 100 nations as the mind of one man, and all obeyed a power which everyone felt to be irresistible. Although the angel had poured his vial on revolution literally into the air, could the result have been more astonishing? It is one leading excellency of the symbols of the apocalypse, that they so truthfully depict the event that they possess a self-evidencing or self-interpreting power. The event forcibly suggests the symbol to the mind. Thus, in tracing the history of the trumpets as given by Gibbon in his, quote, Decline and Fall, unquote, how often do we find the historian selecting the precise metaphors to depict certain events which had been previously employed for the same purpose in the apocalypse. Some of these have been incidentally alluded to in the course of our exposition, but the instances are numerous. We find the same fact occurring in the history of the vials as given by Sir Walter Scott in his quote-unquote Life of Napoleon. Neither Gibbon nor Scott meant to illustrate the predictions of the apocalypse, nor have we reason to think of that book, or were even aware that these symbols had been applied to the events about which they were occupied. But such is their truth to nature, that these two great masters of metaphor could find no imagery more appropriate for describing these events than that very imagery which the Spirit of God had previously employed in predicting them. This is undesigned but striking coincidence. This undesigned but striking coincidence between the figures of history and the symbols of prophecy is evidence of a peculiarly satisfactory kind, that we are correct in our interpretation of the trumpets and vials, but every day is furnishing evidence of the same kind, that we are correct also in our interpretation of the seventh vial. In the comments of the daily journals, we are constantly meeting the symbols of the apocalypse. The drama now in progress far transcends the apprehension of journalists, both in its character and in the important issues it is destined to work out. But the unconscious selection of the symbols of the seventh vial to depict the events of our times is only on account the more striking and valuable. Thus, we find the leading journals of Europe in an article published in its columns in the end of March tracing all the explosions of our times to the very quarter from which we are taught to expect the voices, lightnings, and thunders of the seventh vial. Speaking of Austria, it says, quote, "It is by no means unlikely that in the present state of national feeling in many of the provinces, in the electrical condition of the political atmosphere all over Europe, the fall of central authority, which has so long contrived to neutralize the conflicting tendencies, will be followed by a series of local explosions," unquote. The voices, thunders, and lightnings of this vial were to be followed by a great earthquake. And here we have the subject of our next chapter. Quote, "Such was not since men were upon the earth so mighty an earthquake and so great," unquote. We are thus taught to expect, at the era of the seventh vial, greater changes than any that ever passed upon the world. There was an earthquake when the sixth seal was opened, the fall of paganism. There was an earthquake when the witnesses arose at the Reformation. There was an earthquake when the seventh trumpet was sounded, the first rise of democracy in the old world. But the earthquake of the seventh vial is unequaled since men were upon the earth. Other revolutions altered the framework of government. This will, for a short period at least, abolish it. Other revolutions strongly affected society. This will change the character of society. Here, again, we find that passing events furnish incomparably the best commentary on the prophecy. There never was a revolution since the beginning of time whose causes were so deep-seated as that now in progress in Europe, and the effects that are sure to follow it will therefore be great and durable beyond all former example. The upheavings with which the whole of the continent is agitated come from the very bottom of society. The changes we have seen are not the production of an agency that operates only on the surface. They are the growth of feelings and views with which the whole of European society is leavened. In truth, the change has been going on for a century. It was begun by the infidel writers of France, who sowed industriously the seeds which they now would yield a mighty revolutions, which they knew, let me try that sentence again. It was begun by the infidel writers of France who sowed industriously the seeds which they would yield mighty revolutions to the world after they should have gone to their graves. Yeah, I wanted to read insidiously, not industriously. But yeah, no, this is what the author meant. It is next passed into opinion, and now it has completed its third and great stage and stands before the world I don't know how to read this word, so it's a fait complete or something like that. A fait accompli. History does not furnish an example of such another revolution, a revolution which has advanced gradually yet irresistibly from its first principles, which has molded opinion for itself, which has never advanced a stage till it had first prepared its ground, which has required a century for its growth, and now that it is fully developed, has changed the aspect of the world, for its effects cannot be confined to Europe, but must extend to the farthest verge of civilization. We are accustomed to speak of the 3 French revolutions. But in truth, the great movement in that country, though it has had 3 noted manifestations, is but one and is truly European in its character. This movement was stopped for a while by the Great War, which followed its first outbreak. But no sooner was that war at an end than the movement began again to progress. It is bearing the world onward to a new and untried area. Its course is entirely in the hands of God and lies as far beyond man's control as does that grand movement of the sun and planets, which is every hour advancing our system upon some unknown point in space. It is beyond question the great agent by which the fourth and last monarchy of Daniel is to be broken into pieces. And we see it executing its mission with irresistible and uncontrollable force, abrogating the laws, abolishing the very forms and symbols of authority, and grinding to powder the framework of the iron kingdom of Rome, prostrating thrones, extinguishing dynasties, crushing altars and priesthoods, driving into exile princes and nobles, pouring contempt upon the policy of statesmen and the strength of armies, rocking the chair of St. Peter itself and filling its occupant with inconvincible grief, perplexity, and dismay, and evoking against the 7 hills, whose thunders were wont to shake the world, the mighty winds of popular rage, which threaten every moment to sweep in their fury from the face of the earth that awful throne which has so long enslaved and desolated it. Who can doubt, although he may be unable to tell how many shocks may yet follow, or how long these awful convulsions may continue, that this is the quote-unquote mighty and quote-unquote great earthquake? Let us take a brief survey of the changes which this third and grand development of revolution has already achieved. We look for the governments, the laws, the armies which have borne sway in Europe for the past 1,500 years, which existed apparently in all their strength when the current year opened, and find that they have been shivered by a tremendous blow and driven away as chaff before the tempest. Ere the French Revolution was a month old, it had effected an entire change upon the aspect of Europe. The events of centuries were crowded into as many days. One astounding change followed another with a rapidity which dazzled the imagination, and the occurrences of yesterday gave place, in the astonishment of men, to that caused by more surprising intelligence of today, defying the checks of power and transcending the anticipations of even the most sanguine. The great movement went on, gathering momentum as it proceeded and leveling to the dust all the barriers of a venerable despotism. Let us follow its course and mark its changes. In certain of the Italian principalities, some popular concessions had previously been made. To these it communicated permanency, and still farther enlarged them. It extorted religious freedom from the bigoted monarch of Sardinia. It emancipated the duchies lying at the base of the Alps, Tuscany, Modena, Parma, and lifted the long proscribed Waldenses to an equally equality with their countrymen in civil and religious rights. It excited the wealthy. It excited the wealthy province of Lombardy, which, like Issachar of old, seeing that rest was good and that land pleasant, had couched down between the two burdens of Rome and Austria to rebel against at last the latter yoke. It gave a new impulse to the War of Independence in Sicily. Above all, it told Pius IX that he could no longer deal in sham reforms and no longer amuse his subjects with verbal concessions and constitutions on paper, but must begin in good earnest the work of reform by bestowing real and substantial privileges on the Roman people. We may instance the Neapolitan Constitution as an example of those granted by the chief native princes of Italy. The king is vested in the executive power, but no act of his can force unless countersigned by a minister. Okay, let me get that again. We may instance the Neapolitan Constitution as an example of those granted by the chief native princes of Italy. The king is vested in the executive power, but no act of his can force unless countersigned by a minister. There are two chambers, one of peers and another of deputies. The member of the former are nominated for life. Those of the latter are chosen for a term of 5 years. The number of deputies is in the ratio of 1 for every 40,000 souls, and they are chosen by the citizens possessing a certain amount of income. The ministers of the crown are subject to impeachment before the Chamber of Deputies and to judgment by the peers. The citizens are declared equal before the law. Their dwellings are inviolable, and the press is free. In the other states, the Constitution in its political machinery resembles the Neapolitan. In Tuscany and Piedmont, it is more liberal, securing freedom of commerce and toleration of all religions. But its greatest achievement awaited it on the east of the Po. Austria had been the keystone in the arch of the continental despotism. Austria had been the keystone in the arch of the continental despotism. And when Austria fell, the fabric of European feudalism became a mass of crumbling ruin. The vast change which the revolutionary spirit effected on this country may be conceived of from the single fact, not to dwell on other particulars, that universal suffrage was immediately established, and full liberty was given to all the subjects of the empire to worship according to their conscience. That, too, notwithstanding that the power of the aristocracy and the wealth and pride of the Romish hierarchy had continued up to the present time to be far greater in Austria than in any other country of Europe. North of the Alps, the effects of the Great Revolution were just as palpable as on the south of these mountains. It awoke the spirit of the Germans long repressed and recalled the memory of their ancient liberties and their past renown. It darted a ray of light between the dark clouds which have long rested above the land of Huss. It gave a free government to priest-ridden Bavaria. It gave constitutional privileges to the numerous duchies that girdle the Black Forest, long enthralled by petty tyrants. In the electorates on the Rhine, it produced popular demands which were instantly followed by popular concessions. In the great empire of Prussia and in the neighborhood of kingdoms of Hanover and Saxony, it made its power equally felt. In the former kingdom, a momentary indecision of the monarch served only to render more apparent the force of the movement. In Berlin, the barricades arose, blood flowed, and the populace, triumphing over the throne, were able to dictate their own terms. Thus, in the short space of a single month, it changed the condition of every country lying between Straits of Manessa and the shores of the Baltic. It created, in fact, a new Europe. It established in its countries, by concession at least, the three great bulwarks of civil liberty, namely constitutional government, trial by jury, and the right of public meeting. In the rear of its political changes, it brought likewise vast social and moral meliorations. Some old words here. I've got to learn these words. I don't know them. It rent asunder the chains that bound the press. It abolished the lines of custom houses with which Europe was crossed and recrossed in all directions. And it swept away the restrictions employed to fetter the truth, thus giving to the nations an unrestricted commerce, the free diffusion of knowledge, and liberty to proclaim the truth. It may be some time before the people of Europe are in a condition to profit from these alterations, and it is even possible that these new obstacles may come in the room of those that have been swept away, but it is scarce conceivable that the restrictions on trade, literature, and religion, framed in a dark, ill-informed, and superstitious age, will ever again be generally reenacted. For some weeks after the breaking out of the revolution, there appeared ground to hope that the governments of Europe might be amended without being destroyed. The changes demanded were constitutional in character and moderate in degree. They were prosecuted by peaceable means and conceded in almost every instance as soon as asked for. When all had been granted that was sought, men believed that farther demands would cease to be urged and that princes and people would unite in putting to the test of actual working the new constitutions. But this hope has not been realized. It has been found impossible to stay the progress of change. All attempts at the reconstruction of order have been manifest failures. The hope that authority and rule might be preserved must now be given up. The hope that authority and rule might be preserved must now be given up. The revolution has passed the Rubicon, and the terrible fact stares us in the face that it is on the anarchy that Europe at this moment is drifting. We speak not of the confusion and misrule into which its little princedoms have fallen. Its greatest monarchies are breaking up. Its oldest statesmen are nonplussed, and its mightiest thrones are powerless. There is a moral decomposition going on everywhere. Authority is prostrate. Laws are violated with impunity. And from the Atlantic to the Vistula, kings are little better than captives, and the mob is the sovereign. In the train of these political evils has come a host of commercial and social mischiefs. The ordinary business of life is to a great degree suspended. Commerce paralyzed, trade and manufactures at a standstill. The exchequers woefully impoverished, the lower classes discontented, and at war with those above them, the upper classes terrified and without confidence in the future, the towns swarming with barricade heroes. The towns swarming with barricade heroes, the country with rural marauders, and the masses everywhere ripe for any mischief. What a picture of dislocation and ruin does France present. Look at the once powerful kingdom, the eldest horn of the beast, and one of the chief agents in the slaughter of the witnesses. And see how God is avenging the blood of his saints, for the smoke of her torments is ascending up day and night. Her government is unable to guarantee safety of life and poverty. Her assembly, instead of grappling vigorously with the evils that surround it, is torn by faction and passes its time in indecorous and tumultuary debates. National bankruptcy advances with rapid strides. The expenditure of the monarchy exceeded its income by 2/3 of a million of francs. But the excesses of the Republic is not less than 2 million over its revenue. The citizens live amidst The citizens live amidst perpetual alarms. And then this is probably some French here that I can't read. And are harassed by never-ceasing calls to military duty. Fearful rumors and terrible threats distract the minds of men, which are still farther agitated by conspiracies having avowedly for their object the confiscation of all property in the kingdom and the surrender of the upper and middle classes into the hands of the ruffians and malefactors which infest the country. We know not, indeed, what can arrest the progress of France towards such a catastrophe, unless a special interposition of Providence. If we turn to Austria, we find a gigantic wreck where this magnificent empire once stood. The emperor has fled to the Troil, whither he has been followed by a frightened herd of archdukes and nobles. The dying embers of Triole's loyalty have been unexpectedly fanned by this mark of royal confidence, and it is just possible that the zeal of these mountaineers may bring upon the fallen empire the horrors of a civil war. While we write, Vienna is filled with barricades, and fresh concessions are demanded, which will most probably be yielded. And the same work of confession commenced in Vienna, which is now in progress in Paris. Austria, the successor of the Germanic Caesars, has gathered under her eagle men of every race, the industrious and enterprising Lombard, the acute Illyrian, the stately Hungarian, the meditative German, the persevering Bohemian, the fiery Pole. She has drawn her riches from the flourishing trade of Lombardy, the waving harvests of Galatia, the rich pastures of Bohemia, and the wealthy mines of Carinthia, and Hungary. But the fall of the central authority has set loose all these various nations and dried up all these sources of wealth. The provinces are breaking away from the empire. Austria now exhibits a chaos great in production to her former grandeur. In Italy, disorganization has not proceeded to the same length only because its progress meanwhile is arrested by the war with Austria, but dissensions are rife throughout the peninsula. A sanguinary war is raging on the Po, brought on by the ambition of King Charles Albert, who hopes that Milan will place her iron crown upon his head. The revolting massacre at Naples was broken up. The revolting massacre at Naples has broken up the ill-omened league between the Pope, Albert of Sardinia, and Ferdinand of Naples. and complicated still farther the affairs of Italy. Rome itself has become the scene of tumult. The Jesuits, with their famous general, Ruthan, have been expelled. The cabinet has been purged of ecclesiastics, and though the Pope is still suffered to hold the rank and title of sovereign of the Roman states, he has been completely shorn of the sovereign power. He has had the perplexing alternative proposed to him of drawing the sword against those whom he calls his children, or abdicating the throne of the coronal. Were the kings to look up who were compelled to bend their necks to the Gregories and the Hildebrands of the Middle Ages, how would they grimly smile to see the foot of the Roman mob upon the neck of Pius? If we turn to Germany, the prostration of authority and the decomposition of society are as great almost as in France and Austria. The king is distrusted, the ministers are unpopular. The Constituent Assembly is distinguished only for its incapacity and is miserably inadequate for such a crisis as the present. The laws of Prussia have been virtually repealed, and the edicts that now govern the empire are to be learned from the inflammatory placards that now cover the streets. In Berlin, the ministers have been obliged to open the arsenal and distribute arms to the workmen, by whom they may soon be employed against the very authority that bestowed them. Okay, I'm going to check and see where we're at here. I think I'm going to close it up. Well, I got 5 more pages to go. Okay, well, I'll keep going. Commerce is stagnant. Commerce is stagnant, and the resources of private wealth are daily diminishing. Swarms of beggars infest towns and enter dwellings to demand rather than beg alms. And bands of ruffians traverse the country, committing pillage and massacre, and setting fire to the castles of the nobles and the seats of the landed proprietors. The agents of revolution, or rather destruction, are active and sleepless. The youth of the universities and the orators of the clubs are continually inflaming the passions of the populace by their communist doctrines. The same reports reach us from every town and village of Germany. The Germans speak of unity. It is not the reign of unity that is commencing, but that of total, consummate, and universal disorganization. The shocks of the great earthquake are continued. The islands flee away, and the mountains are not found. We think, then, that we have evidence to satisfy us that we are arrived at the breaking up of the image, the final dissolution and complete removal of the 10 kingdoms of the modern Roman world foretold by Daniel. And if, as is generally admitted, the present European governments cannot be longer maintained, or rather restored, for they are already prostrate. It is plain to demonstration that the final doom of the papacy is at hand. This may be inferred with certainty from the predictions both of Daniel and of John. The fourth monarchy was not succeeded by a fifth, but the kingdom set up by the God of heaven, which implies the fall, along with the fourth monarchy, of all tyrannical governments and idolatrous churches. But may not that monarchy be prolonged under a different form of government? Not a few expect Europe to become republican. Others look for the formation of one or two great monarchies under adequate military and political talent, which the convulsion is to call forth. May not the papacy link itself on the coming republic or the coming monarchy, and so recover its ascendancy? These anticipations receive no countenance from the facts, the moral elements on which all governments must be based do not exist at present in Europe. The political creed of its masses, as we have already said, is communism, and their religious creed is atheism. Until the continent has undergone a vast moral change, we do seriously believe that no government of any sort, not even a republic, can be carried on. We may appeal to France. Her example shows that it is something much beyond republicanism into which the Western world is sinking. But when we turn to prophecy, we are certainly informed that the present governments cannot be succeeded by others, that Europe cannot become a congeries of republics. The image was smitten upon its 10 toes, and its fragments, so far from becoming reunited, became as the chaff of the summer thrashing floor, and the wind carried them away, a striking symbol of the change now in progress. No union of the 10 kingdoms into one or two great monarchies. In the Apocalypse, we are told that the beast that emerged from the flood of the Gothic invasion should, in its 8th head and 10 horns, go into perdition, and in full accordance with that intimation, the kings appear with the beast and the false prophet on the last scene of Babylon's destruction. At what an awful crisis are we arrived? If we are right in our interpretation, what vast changes, what fearful calamities is the present generation destined to witness and endure? We can look for no pause in present convulsions. On the contrary, we must expect that they shall go on till authority has been utterly postulated and society utterly dissolved, and papal Europe has been sacked and pillaged and become one wide social conflagration, with the smoke of its torment ascending up day and night. Now is come the, quote, time of trouble, unquote, foretold by Daniel, quote, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time, unquote. These days of vengeance, spoken of by our Lord, the time when God shall assemble all the heathen to be judged. Now is come, quote, the time of his wrath, unquote. And now is to be spread the supper of the great God, unquote, to which all the fowls that fly in the midst of heaven are invited. The time of forbearance with the papal nations is ended, and a judicial period has commenced. Short but awful. God will reckon with the world before passing to a new dispensation and avenge all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the martyrs that fell under pagan Rome to those that perished upon the gibbets of Scotland, or were shot on her mountains and now sleep amid the green slopes of the Pentlands. The first effect of the great earthquake was the tripartition of the great city. And this is where we will go next time. We will leave it off for here because we just reached an hour and my voice is shot, and that's it. Catch up with you then. God bless.